Now that's kind of where governments are starting to play, because they see the value of that upskilling, that alignment between labor market, the need for individuals to make those transitions, but also to ensure that individuals are given the opportunity to develop those skills in a laddering way as well.
How do you give people second chances, or how do we recognize their knowledge if they haven't been to higher education or after they have actually gained a lot of new experience in the labor market, etc. And actually these credentials, digital credentials, allow for much more granularity and provide a new way to actually operationalize the recognition of prior learning, especially because when they are articulated with kind of ready-made, validated content by institutions, etc.
I love the fact about equality. I think that actually is the power of micro-credentials. I think it opens up the space to be able to show lifelong learning capability, the way people can pivot, youngsters can prove what they've been doing in terms of external curricular activity, etc. And I sort of like to add to the mix, because I've been building capability frameworks that underpin micro-credentials and digital badging for a while, that to be able to assess holistically and measure the employability skills like critical thinking, innovation, the types of things that are absolutely essential in order to ensure that both early learners and more mature learners and those that need to pivot can actually be measured and show capability within a particular area.
The mere incentive aspect of digital credentials, even if they're not articulated too much, so the value that it has to people themselves, to receive that's an incentive. And how this can connect to, things that we usually agree with, like, for example, we want people to be more of critical thinkers, to be good collaborators, communication, but we know that it is difficult to actually assess through our usual ways of assessments, the exams or and so how we can actually use that as an incentive for, teachers to develop the skills that are related to that, or for the students themselves actually to demonstrate that in addition to having, their, let's say, high school degree, they also have actually had chances to demonstrate that they were good at this or at that.
I think where it's transformative is that now that we're in this digital age where, when you create resumes and portfolios, you want to have that immediate kind of link to something online. It's incredibly helpful to be able to put together this digital portfolio and to be able to show these digital badges that pop up instantly when employers are looking through my package and they're interested in what credentials I have, both formally and perhaps, education that I've sought out separately on my own that may not be accredited, but again, speak to those kind of skills and competencies that are starting to be recognized in society.
We're seeing a very different shift towards what students want and need. And part of that is being driven by the changing nature of the workforce, the cost of education, and the need to be nimble and responsive to a variety of different needs as both industry and the labor market requires, but also I think what students want.
I think it's also really a societal change that happened, which is reflected by digitalization. I think that Ash was right about the individualization aspect. And one relates also to this idea of owning actually all these credentials, and that people, have these portfolios of credentials, that they can actually have their data, that they can, so build their trajectories. And so it's really shifted from a more institutional to more individual, and in some ways, relates to individualization of society.
I think also the opportunity, as you mentioned, like to connect with experts and organizations that will help them add to their portfolio of experience. That's another really key piece. And then I think just knowing that dashboard of credentials will eventually become really a replacement for what we're seeing more traditionally as a transcript model for us in schools, so that they have really a a very personalized and customized framework. And I feel like we're all speaking the same language, but really it really does create that alignment.
The workforce is changing and the demographics of that workforce. People are not necessarily going to be able to step away and do a 3-year and a 4-year diploma or degree anymore. How do they start looking at the nimbleness of micro-credentials, the stackability of that, and also the idea that they're not terminal, that they can be laddered and transferable within that. And institutions will start to see the value of them in terms of not displacing traditional credentials, but augmenting the capacity of an institution. And again, going back to the equality of education and the cost of education and the changing nature of our workforce. Our public institutions need to be able to adapt to that. I think we're starting to see that discussion unfold.
Starting out school K to 12, and that ability to be able to help those that perhaps aren't traditional academics or really great at academia, but are really bright, but we don't have the measurements in traditional school at the moment to be able to show their abilities and their capabilities and the fact that they really have a great deal to offer within the environment.
I think micro-credentials and digital credentials are also driving a particular need of what students want and their engagement and their ability to engage in their own educational trajectories. That's going to be a factor that I think is going to continue to shift this. It's not the only driver, but I think the student and the student needs and what they're expecting and what they need as they move through is going to drive how we start to think about this.
I think it's a lot about a shift of power in the classroom too. And I think it's about students just being able to choose what their pathways are and being able to, as I said, like it's really important to us that we give our students that lifelong learning ability. And so if we've actually taught them to look and find what they want to learn, and then they know how to sort of dig away at it and demonstrate that they, and sort of defend the fact that they've achieved that expectation, then I think we really truly have set them up for that. And it's no longer about me, the teacher, owning that specific wedge of information that we pass along to them, that they actually own it and we become coaches and guides for their learning.
Again, to that, to that social space and the LinkedIn, I mean, there's a lot of excitement, particularly within the United States in terms of being able to badge against internships, unpaid and paid internships for year 12s, so that they can actually differentiate themselves in the marketplace. But also, again, going back to that low socioeconomic cohort that you can't actually show their differentiator, and to be able to work with industry and to be able to use LinkedIn as a vehicle to be able to show that they have achieved capabilities and that they do have digital badges that have been awarded against those capabilities, actually starts to really, to your earlier point, Stéphan, start to give a common playing ground for people to be able to gain employment because of the equality that, this space potentially offers. So, some really exciting stuff Convergence is working in at the moment.
One reason why we can do it as well is because of, I would say, the changes in the digital world and the fact that they're verifiable and they are affordable, in some ways, so that it's not too expensive to do that. And we know that, we're not entering into the business where people say, oh, no, let's say the OECD gives credentials, and so anyone can print their thing and it will be somewhere else, So I think that's a very important aspect, that, there was a monopoly, de facto monopoly of institutions, accredited institutions, to deliver degrees or formal qualifications. And so while what we're doing is still not formal, it can be verified, and that makes a lot of difference. So the fact that it's more authentic.
We're actually seeing some serious investment here in Victoria, in Australia, from the state government in terms of building capability frameworks to underpin vocational education, recognising that that is an absolutely necessary spot, that most of, certainly here in Australia, 80% of micro-credentialing has been happening at that very top higher end. And in actual fact, where it's really needed is at that more vocational space in order to be able to help those transition into jobs that, you know, are new and emerging. So it's good to see some governments that are starting to input into that lower end.
We've in fact had a great partnership with Convergence in having our students acquire a blockchain certification. We've looked at organizations like Google and Adobe. And so those, you know, all those wonderful partnerships, we've built connections with different universities as well. And so what I think that does for our students is that it gives them a really broad educational experience, so that they are not just, we're preparing them for the future to become lifelong learners, so that they're identifying with what's being earned, and they're working through the process and going through a full understanding of how these credentials can be worked and built into their entire lives.
Here in Australia, there has already been some movement to ensure that credentialing articulates within both the vocational space and also within the higher education space. And as a result of that, we're seeing people being able to prove capability in areas that they're actually very good at, but don't have formal qualifications. And so consequently, they're able to, through measurement within a capability framework that is underpinning the credentials, be able to gain RPL into various different award qualifications.
I think one thing that I've really appreciated in working together with the Convergence team is that transferability and the way the model is designed. The other thing I really love about it is the data ownership is in the hands of the students, so that they completely control who they're sharing that credential with. They make all those choices. And I mean, data privacy is a huge conversation for us in our school. But what's really happening with our credentialing model through Convergence is the students actually own the wallet. They can use credentials that we've created in-house and put it within that wallet. They can take credentials that they've earned from external organizations and put that in that context as well. But it's them that owns it. It's not, we are not as a school administrators over that. And I think that's really interesting and a changed mindset as well.
I think one of the other pieces that's so important in what we were finding in Alberta, and I think other jurisdictions now as well, in terms of even here in BC, is that collaborative relationship, that these are not to be done to industry, they are to be done with industry, and be a collaborative developer of that knowledge and what's expected. But I think one of the other pieces that's so important is the creation of portals. And this is where I think Australia has done just a brilliant job in terms of the federal government, or at least the last I read was that they were creating a portal that was accessibility for industry and students in post-secondaries to create that environment where there's a knowledge, understanding of how they can be accessed and be a part of that process. How do we nudge that? How do we create those environments? But it is a collaborative process. And I think the more industry and post-secondaries and government work together, the better we will see this sort of stimulus of these ideas and the stimulus of good programs that industry also feels have value for them. And it is a talent pipeline that is being created with their sort of influence in as well.
I think on both ends, and I think this is why these kind of conversations are really important. It's important to first educate everybody as to what they are, how they can be used, why they're important, so that there's this ability to to speak about them and use them in any sort of effective way.
Bev Oliver, whom you alluded, she has just worked for UNESCO on coming up with a common definition of microcredentialing, which pivots into a number of other attempts for common definitions so that they can be used globally. And that's really important because the landscape at the moment is so mired with different, what do we actually mean? And so the 4 elements that have come out are, an ability to be able to assess the types of hours around what a microcredential might look like, the kind of framework that underpins it so that it actually has some rigor, so that in fact we can start to use a common language. And that's really, I think, absolutely vital in order to be able to build the ecosystem that we're all talking about, which is actually not that far away, but it is the need to be able to ensure that we don't build in silos and that there is then no cohesiveness in regard to the global currency that this really does offer in terms of transformational education and the ways in which individualized education pathways can occur. Microcredentials are this ability to be able to bring both industry and professional associations and the education system together to ensure that learners are empowered. And as long as we can build these common definitions and frameworks to underpin so that it's a very clear ability to be able to talk about this and articulate across, we're in for a really good ride.
It needs to be a collaborative approach in terms of both the academic institutions, the academics, the students, industry, to articulate what is one credible, but also rigorous in terms of the outcomes and the objectives of what the program or microcredential digital certification is achieving. These are some of the critical issues that we're all going to be asking, but it is about rigor. It is about clarity and collaboration. And I think one of the other things that's important to keep in mind is the credibility of where the badges sit. It's again, that becomes a critical piece in that articulation of credibility, assurance that outcomes have been met, and that this student is actually presenting something that is viable and can be certainly articulated as being worthwhile.
To undertake credentialing and to be awarded for skill capability is incredibly empowering. And as a result, there's a lot of women in leadership organizations and different types of programs that are really starting to embrace this.
So one of the focuses of the microcredentials was to enable that flexibility, to enable women to become engaged once more into the workforce. One of the other things that I've been paying attention to as well is the not employed, not in education and not in training sector, which is the population of youth between the ages of 18 to 25, depending on which criteria you use. And within that group globally, it is women who make up the largest percentage of that population. And what microcredentials and these kinds of opportunities can do is to help engage those individuals back in not only the education world, but also into the training world, and then to launch into employment. So as we think about the development of some of these and the flexibility and the equality of them, it is that sector that truly will benefit and hopefully will benefit from those opportunities and be engaged in the workforce again. That idea of upskilling and reskilling needs to be sort of flexible, certainly for different segments of our society.
It's a tool, that's a means to actually empower people and to make, to try one more tool to try to address, the kind of social equity that we want to achieve.
We've had such a great relationship with Convergence over the years, so I'm grateful for that powerful work that we've done together.